The maintenance bay on Horizon's edge smelled like recycled air, machine oil, and the particular brand of frustration that came from fighting malfunctioning environmental systems for the third consecutive week. Jake Morrison wiped his hands on a rag that was somehow making them dirtier instead of cleaner, and contemplated the injustice of being senior maintenance engineer on a station where nothing stayed fixed for more than 48 hours. "The communal quarters are approaching uninhabitable," Lyra said from across the workbench, her melodious voice carrying that particular tone that meant she was understating a problem significantly. Jake looked up at his work partner of 3 months. Lyra was Scifi, which meant she was several inches shorter than his 6 feet, with a build that looked delicate but could handle heavy equipment with surprising strength. Her skin was opalescent, shifting through subtle colors depending on mood and lighting, currently a pale silver blue that suggested she was cold. Her eyes were large and luminous, adapted for lower light conditions than Earth standard, and they had a way of looking at him that made Jake feel simultaneously valued and slightly dissected. The Scifi were relatively new to human contact. Their species had only joined the broader galactic community about 20 years ago, and they approached everything with scientific curiosity mixed with careful reserve. Lyra had been assigned to Horizon's Edge as part of a cultural exchange program, and Jake had been designated her work partner because he'd scored highest on the unlikely to make an interspecies incident assessment. So far he'd managed not to cause any diplomatic disasters, which he considered a personal victory. "How uninhabitable are we talking?" Jake asked, already dreading the answer. "Last night the temperature dropped to 4 degrees Celsius. The humidity controls are malfunctioning, creating condensation on all surfaces. The air circulation system produces sounds that prevented sleep. And this morning, I discovered frost formation on interior walls." "Frost inside the habitat module on a space station?" "Yes." Lyra's skin shifted to slightly darker blue, which Jake had learned meant she was stressed or uncomfortable. "I am aware this is not optimal living conditions." "That's not optimal, that's Arctic exploration without proper gear." Jake set down his tools with more force than necessary. "I filed 6 repair requests for those quarters." "How has nothing been fixed?" "I believe maintenance resources are being directed to critical systems. Life support, propulsion, that sort of thing. Mere habitability comfort is lower priority." "You're literally frosting over in your sleep." "That seems pretty critical." Lyra's skin flickered with colors Jake couldn't quite read, quick shifts between blue and something almost pink. "I do not wish to complain. I understand resource constraints." Jake felt something protective activate in his chest, which was probably not appropriate for a working relationship, but he was too tired to care about appropriate right now. "Screw resource constraints. You can't sleep in a freezer." "I have been managing." "Managing is not the same as being comfortable and safe." Jake pulled up the maintenance schedule on his datapad, scrolling through the endless list of repair requests that all seemed to be marked pending or delayed or maybe eventually if we have time. His personal quarters were marked as functioning, low priority, which meant they'd at least stay habitable while other systems failed. An idea formed, probably a stupid idea, definitely a joke, the kind of thing you said to be sympathetic and supportive without actually meaning literally. "At this rate, you're welcome to crash in my quarters," Jake said, not looking up from his datapad. "At least the environmental controls actually work there. Heat, proper humidity, no mysterious frost formation. Revolutionary concept." Silence. Jake looked up and immediately knew he'd said something significant because Lyra had gone completely still. Not just stopped moving still, but frozen in place still, like someone had hit pause on her entire existence. Her opalescent skin was shifting through colors rapidly, pale gold to soft pink to something almost lavender, cycling faster than he'd ever seen. Her large, luminous eyes were fixed on him with an intensity that made every nerve in his body activate alert status. You are offering shared sleeping space. Lyra asked, and her voice carried weight that suggested this was not a casual question, not a simple clarification, but something profoundly significant. Jake's brain, which had been operating on insufficient sleep and too much recycled station coffee, tried to catch up with what was apparently happening. I mean, I was sort of joking, but honestly the communal quarters sound genuinely terrible. If you need somewhere warm and functional to sleep until maintenance actually fixes things properly, the offer's real. I've got a couch that's pretty comfortable. A couch? Lyra repeated the word like she was testing it for hidden meaning. Not your actual sleeping platform. Well, no, I mean that would be. Jake paused, trying to figure out how to explain human personal space norms. The couch is fine, plenty of space, completely separate from my bedroom. In my culture, Lyra said slowly, her skin still doing those rapid color shifts, offering to share sleeping space is a profound statement. It is not done casually or lightly. It indicates deep trust, willingness to be vulnerable in another's presence, acceptance of another being into private space where defenses are naturally lowered. You specifically said I was welcome in your bed. Jake's brain short-circuited briefly. I said quarters. I'm pretty sure I said quarters. You said crash in my quarters, and then mentioned your bed working correctly, while mine does not. In Sci-Fi understanding, this is explicit invitation to share sleeping space, which carries extremely significant cultural meaning. I was making a joke, sort of, about the bed part anyway. Jake set down his datapad carefully because his hands had started doing that nervous thing where they needed something to hold. Humans joke. We say things we don't literally mean for humor purposes or to show sympathy without actual commitment. Lyra's skin shifted to blue-green that suggested confusion mixed with something else Jake couldn't identify. But you also said the offer was genuine if I needed somewhere warm and functional. Which parts of your statement were joke and which were genuine offer? Jake realized he'd stumbled directly into some kind of cultural miscommunication minefield and had no idea how to navigate out without making things worse. Okay, let me clarify. The offer to stay in my quarters is genuine if the communal ones are genuinely uninhabitable, which they sound like they are. You can absolutely use my couch, which is actually comfortable because I fall asleep on it regularly. The specific comment about the bed was exaggeration for comic effect. Humans have this communication style where we say outrageous or exaggerated things to show we care without actually meaning the literal words. So you did not mean to invite me to share your actual sleeping platform with you. Not the same sleeping platform, no. Different sleeping surfaces within the same quarters. You on the couch, me in the bedroom, appropriate distance and privacy maintained. Lyra was quiet for a long moment, her skin cycling through colors that moved too fast for Jake to interpret accurately. This is confusing. Sci-Fi do not joke about sleeping arrangements. To offer shared sleeping space is to offer trust and intimacy. To retract or clarify such offer after making it would be considered profound insult, suggesting the initial offer was not genuine or was made in bad faith. I'm not trying to insult you, Jake said quickly. I'm trying to clarify that I made what I thought was an obvious joke that apparently doesn't translate culturally at all. But you confirm the quarters offer remains genuine. I may stay in your private living space. Yes, absolutely. The couch is comfortable, you'd have complete privacy. The environmental controls actually maintain comfortable temperature and humidity, and you wouldn't wake up with frost on your walls like some kind of Arctic expedition gone wrong. Then I accept your offer, Lyra said simply, her skin stabilizing into something between silver and pale blue. I will gather my belongings from communal quarters and relocate to your space. When should I arrive? Jake opened his mouth to respond, then closed it, then opened it again, feeling remarkably like a fish that had been unexpectedly removed from water. You want to move in, like today. The communal quarters are uninhabitable. You have offered functional alternative. Accepting logical solutions is efficient. Her skin flickered briefly pink. Unless you are retracting the offer. No, I'm not retracting anything. Jake ran his hand through his hair, a nervous habit he'd never managed to break. This escalated quickly from commiseration about broken environmental controls. You made offer, I accepted offer. This is straightforward transaction. Except it didn't feel straightforward. It felt complicated in ways Jake couldn't articulate, especially with Lyra looking at him with those large luminous eyes that seemed to see far more than he was comfortable with anyone seeing. Okay, he said finally. Yeah, okay. You can move in. Today works. I'll clear some space, make sure the couch has proper bedding. We'll figure out bathroom schedules and kitchen access and all that cohabitation logistics stuff. Thank you, Jake Morrison. Lyra used his full name in that formal way she did sometimes, making it sound weighty and significant. This is generous offer. I am grateful. She was already moving toward the maintenance bay exit with purpose, presumably to gather her belongings, leaving Jake standing alone trying to figure out how a sympathetic joke about his coworker's terrible living conditions had just turned into his coworker moving into his quarters. His private quarters, that he'd lived alone in for 8 months, that were about to contain another person. A person from a species where shared sleeping space apparently meant something far more significant than he'd intended to convey. This was going to be more complicated than he'd anticipated. Jake was certain of that much, even if he had absolutely no idea how complicated it would actually become. 6 hours later, Jake's quarters felt substantially smaller than they had that morning. Not physically smaller. The space hadn't changed dimensions, but perceptually smaller in that way that happens when another person's presence makes you acutely aware of every cubic meter. Lyra had arrived with a single small pack of belongings, which she'd set down carefully near the couch Jake had designated as her space. But instead of immediately settling in or unpacking, or doing any of the normal things someone might do when moving into a new space, she was standing in the middle of his main living area with her skin cycling through colors that suggested she was processing something significant. Her large eyes moved slowly around the room, taking in everything with careful attention. Jake's small desk covered in maintenance manuals and technical specifications. His collection of actual physical books from Earth, expensive luxuries on a space station, where every kilogram cost money to transport. The few personal photos he kept displayed, family, friends, his dog from childhood who died years ago but who he still missed. The window showing the station's exterior view of stars that never moved because they were too distant for human perception of motion. These are your private quarters, Lyra said softly, and there was something almost reverent in her tone. Your most personal space. You allow very few beings to enter here. Yeah, pretty much just me usually. Jake was awkwardly trying to clear space in his small storage area for Lyra's belongings, even though she'd barely brought anything. Maintenance staff get individual quarters as part of the compensation package, but they're not huge, so I don't typically invite people over. It's kind of my retreat from the rest of the station. And yet you invited me here, into your most private, personal space where you retreat from others. Lyra's skin flushed a pale gold color that Jake didn't have reference for yet. This is profoundly significant gesture among Scifi. We do not enter another being's private quarters without deep trust being established. The quarters are extension of self. Allowing another into that space is allowing them into your life in meaningful way. Jake stopped his awkward storage reorganization to look at her. For humans, privacy is nice, but it's not quite that profound. I mean, we like having our own space, but it's more about comfort and convenience than deep philosophical statements about self and trust. For Scifi, the boundaries are clearer. Lyra moved slowly through the space, her fingers trailing lightly over Jake's desk, his chair, his books, like she was learning about him through his possessions. We maintain strict separation between public and private selves. Public spaces are for work, casual social interaction, surface-level engagement. Private quarters are for vulnerability, genuine self-expression, the person beneath the social performance. To be invited into private quarters means you trust that person to see your genuine self. Jake was starting to understand the cultural gap here was significantly wider than he'd initially calculated. I'm literally just offering a warm place to sleep, while maintenance fixes your regular quarters. But sleeping is when we are most vulnerable, Lyra said, and she'd moved to the doorway of his bedroom now, looking at his unmade bed, standard station-issue sleeping platform with rumpled sheets, because Jake had never mastered the art of making beds properly and didn't see the point when he was just going to unmake it again in 16 hours. To allow another being to be present in the same space while you sleep is to trust them completely with your safety and well-being. Asleep, you cannot defend yourself, cannot maintain social performance, cannot control what you reveal. You trust me with your safety during this vulnerable state. The way she phrased it made the whole thing sound far more weighty than, "Hey, you can crash on my couch." Jake moved to stand near her, careful to maintain appropriate personal space distance. "I mean, yeah, we've been working together for 3 months. Offer, not merely because my quarters are cold, but because you are a person I would feel safe being vulnerable around." She was still looking at his bed. Jake was acutely aware that his bedroom suddenly felt like the most important room in his quarters, which was stupid because it was literally just where he slept and kept his clothes. "This is where you sleep," Lyra said, and it wasn't quite a question, more an observation that carried extra meaning he couldn't decode. "Yeah, which is why you're taking the couch in the main area. It's actually surprisingly comfortable. I fall asleep there all the time when I'm reading or watching media. You'll have complete privacy. But you said I was welcome in your bed." Those large luminous eyes turned to focus on him directly. Was that statement entirely joke, or was there genuine offering beneath the humor? Jake felt like he'd walked into a test he hadn't studied for. It was a joke. Humans say things they don't literally mean as a form of humor or exaggeration. I didn't actually mean we would share the same sleeping platform. "Why not?" The question was so direct it caught him completely off guard. "Because that would be inappropriate. We're colleagues, friends possibly, but we don't have the kind of relationship where sharing a bed would be appropriate." What kind of relationship would make bed sharing appropriate in human culture? Romantic relationship usually. Sometimes very close platonic friendships, but that's less common. Sharing a bed is considered intimate behavior for humans. "It is also intimate for Sci-Fi," Lyra said, finally moving away from his bedroom doorway back toward the main living area and the couch that was apparently going to be her sleeping space. Which is precisely why offering it carries such profound meaning. We do not share sleeping space casually, or with those we do not trust deeply and care for significantly. She settled onto the couch with that fluid grace that seemed natural to her species. Her skin, finally stabilizing into a soft blue color that Jake had learned meant she was content or at peace. But she was still watching him with those eyes that seemed to see more than he wanted anyone to see. "You care for me significantly?" she asked, her voice quiet but clear. Jake sat down in his desk chair, trying to maintain some sense of normalcy in a conversation that had become far more complicated than he'd anticipated. "I care about you as a colleague and friend, yes. You're excellent at your job, easy to work with, pleasant company during long maintenance shifts. But not romantic caring. No, that would be inappropriate. You're my coworker. There are protocols about workplace relationships. Humans have extensive rules about what relationships are appropriate and when," Lyra observed, her skin shifting to thoughtful purple. "Sci-Fi approach is different. We are less concerned with categorical rules and more concerned with genuine feeling and mutual consent." "What does that mean exactly?" It means if two scifi feel connection to each other and both consent to exploring that connection, the category of relationship, coworkers, friends, acquaintances, is less important than the genuine emotion underneath. Your culture seems to require relationships to fit into specific approved categories before certain types of interaction are permitted. Jake thought about how to respond to that. It's not that simple. There are good reasons for workplace relationship protocols. Power dynamics, potential conflicts of interest, professional complications if things don't work out. We work as equals. There is no power imbalance. Conflicts of interest seem minimal in maintenance engineering assignments, and things not working out is risk in any relationship regardless of context. Lyra tilted her head in that way she did when she was analyzing something. It seems your protocols are designed to prevent connection rather than facilitate healthy connection. They're designed to prevent complicated situations. And yet you have invited me into your private quarters to sleep here, Lyra said gently. By your own cultural standards regarding workplace boundaries, have you not already created potentially complicated situation? She had a point. Jake was pretty sure there were actual regulations somewhere about housing coworkers in your personal quarters without proper authorization. This is temporary emergency measure, just until maintenance fixes the communal environmental controls. And if I wished for it to be less temporary, Lyra, I don't think that's. I am not suggesting anything inappropriate by your cultural standards, she interrupted quickly, her skin flashing briefly pink. I simply mean that I find your presence comfortable. Your quarters are peaceful. The environmental controls function properly. I would not object to remaining here for extended period if you were amenable to such arrangement. But Jake didn't quite know what to do with that statement. Let's just see how it goes. Maybe the communal quarters will be fixed soon. Perhaps, Lyra said, but her tone suggested she was not particularly optimistic about maintenance response times. She was already settling into the couch, curling up with that feline-like grace her species seemed to naturally possess. Thank you for allowing me into your space, Jake Morrison. It is genuinely generous offering, whether you intended it as joke or not. You're welcome, Jake managed, feeling like this conversation had gotten away from him somewhere around the point where she'd asked if he cared for her significantly. That night Jake lay in his bed, in his private quarters, acutely aware that for the first time in 8 months there was another person present in his living space. He could hear Lyra's breathing from the main room, quiet and steady, and somehow soothing in a way he hadn't expected. The recycled air circulation system created white noise that usually helped him sleep, but tonight his brain was too active, processing the unexpected shift from sympathetic joke to coworker has moved into my quarters. He'd been joking about sharing his bed. Sort of joking. Mostly joking. The kind of joke where you're being supportive and sympathetic without meaning it literally, but also maybe there's some tiny genuine part of you that meant it more than you want to admit to yourself. And Lyra had taken it seriously, had accepted it as genuine offer with profound cultural meaning, had moved into his quarters within hours of him making the statement. Either he'd just made a significant cross-cultural miscommunication error, or he'd accidentally offered something his subconscious had wanted to offer, but his conscious mind had been too cautious to actually propose. Jake suspected it might be both simultaneously, which seemed appropriately complicated for his life. In the main room, Lyra was probably already asleep, comfortable and warm in his quarters, trusting him with her vulnerability in ways that seemed far more significant than he'd intended when he'd made his stupid joke about her crashing in his bed. This was going to be interesting. Jake was certain of that, even if he couldn't define what interesting would actually mean. 3 days into what Jake kept insisting to himself was a temporary emergency living arrangement, patterns had started to emerge. He woke up each morning to find Lyra already awake, usually sitting on the couch with her datapad, reading something in her own language while her opalescent skin cycled through peaceful morning colors. soft golds and pale blues that suggested she was content and rested. She was remarkably easy to live with. Her belongings stayed neatly organized in the small corner he designated as hers. She was considerate about bathroom time, never hogging the sonic shower or leaving her personal items scattered across shared surfaces. She was quiet during his sleep cycle, respectful about his work schedules, and seemed to intuitively understand when he needed space versus when he was open to conversation. It should have been fine. Should have been a straightforward situation of colleagues temporarily sharing quarters, until station maintenance got around to fixing environmental controls in the communal areas. Except there were complications Jake hadn't anticipated. The first night had been fine, both of them maintaining appropriate distance, Lyra on the couch in the main room, Jake in his bedroom with the door half closed for privacy. But around 300 station time, Jake had woken to sounds from the main living area. Not alarming sounds exactly, but unusual ones. Movement, quiet distress. He'd gotten up to investigate, finding Lyra standing by the environmental control panel. Her skin pale and flickering through colors he'd learned meant distress or discomfort. She was wearing sleep clothes that were clearly designed for warmth, but still seemed insufficient. And she was trembling slightly in a way that activated every protective instinct Jake possessed. The temperature readout showed 18 degrees Celsius, cool but not extreme by human standards, perfectly within normal station parameters. But Lyra was clearly cold in ways that went beyond mild discomfort. "The environmental controls are malfunctioning," she said when she noticed Jake standing there, her voice slightly unsteady. "I apologize for disturbing your sleep." Jake checked the panel. Everything looked normal by human standards, but he'd read the scifi species profile during her first week on station. They preferred significantly warmer temperatures than humans. Their homeworld was tropical, and their metabolism functioned optimally around 28 to 30 degrees Celsius. What felt cool but fine to Jake was genuinely cold to Lyra's physiology. "It's not malfunctioning," Jake explained, already moving to adjust the temperature upward. "Station defaults to human comfortable temperatures. I should have thought to adjust it for scifi preferences. I'm sorry. I do not wish to impose my comfort requirements on your personal space." "You're not imposing, you're literally shivering. I can handle warmer temperatures better than you can handle cold." He pushed the environmental controls up to 26 degrees, which would be warmish for humans but hopefully more comfortable for scifi physiology. But even as the temperature slowly adjusted, Lyra was still clearly uncomfortable. Her skin remained pale, the trembling didn't immediately stop. Jake grabbed the extra blanket from his storage area and brought it to her. "Here. This should help until the temperature stabilizes." Lyra accepted the blanket with visible gratitude, wrapping it around her shoulders. But even bundled up, she was obviously still cold, her delicate frame shivering slightly, her skin flickering through distressed colors. Jake felt guilt wash over him in waves. She was suffering because he'd made a joke that had turned into an invitation, because she'd accepted that invitation, because his quarters weren't properly configured for her species' needs. This was his fault. "Look," he said before his brain could properly review what he was about to propose, "the bed is warmer. It's closer to the heating vent, has better thermal blankets. You should take the bed, I'll take the couch." "I cannot take your sleeping platform," Lyra protested immediately. "You offered me the couch. I accepted those specific terms. I will not displace you from your own bed in your own quarters." "The terms are changing due to environmental factors. You're cold. The bed will be warmer, take the bed." They argued about it for 20 minutes. Lyra insisted she couldn't take his sleeping platform. That would be inappropriate and imposing. Jake insisted it was his quarters and therefore his decision, and his decision was that she should be warm and comfortable. Around and around they went, both stubborn, neither willing to accept the other's proposed solution, until Jake's exhausted brain offered what seemed like a perfectly logical compromise. Fine, he said, running his hand through his hair in frustration. The bed is rated for 2 humans, which means it's definitely big enough for human and Savathi, who's smaller than average human. We share the bed, both stay warm, both actually get sleep. This is practical solution to thermal comfort problem. He regretted the words immediately when Lyra went very still. Her skin shifting through that gold-pink lavender combination he was starting to recognize as deeply significant. You are offering shared sleeping space now, she said quietly, carefully. Genuinely offering this time, not joke. Jake's brain finally caught up with his mouth, but he was committed now. I'm offering practical solution to temperature problem. You're cold. I generate excess body heat by human standards. Sharing sleeping space makes thermal sense. Savathi do not distinguish between practical reasoning and emotional reasoning in the context of sleeping arrangements, Lyra said, her large eyes fixed on him with that intensity again. Sharing sleeping space is sharing sleeping space, regardless of stated practical justification. But you're cold, Jake said, which wasn't really addressing her point, but was the only coherent thought his exhausted brain could produce. You shouldn't have to be cold. No, I should not. Lyra's skin stabilized into that soft blue that meant contentment or acceptance. If you are genuinely offering shared sleeping space, I accept, with understanding that this carries significant meaning in my culture, whether or not it carries such meaning in yours. Jake knew he should clarify, should establish boundaries, should probably back out of this entire situation. Instead, he just said, "Get in the bed, Lyra, we're both adults. We can share space without it becoming weird." That first night of actually sharing the bed was profoundly awkward for Jake, and apparently quite significant for Lyra. They maintained careful distance. Jake stayed rigidly on his usual side, Lyra curled up on the opposite side, and there was a deliberate gap between them that neither crossed. But sometime during the night cycle, Jake woke to find that careful gap had closed. Lyra had migrated closer in her sleep, unconsciously seeking warmth, and was now pressed against his side with her head somewhere near his shoulder. Her skin was touching his arm, direct contact, and he could feel how much cooler her body temperature was compared to human standard, even though she was clearly warmer than she'd been on the couch. He should have moved away, should have maintained that appropriate distance, should have gently shifted her back to her side of the bed without waking her. Instead, Jake found himself staying very still, letting her sleep peacefully, trying to ignore how natural this felt. How right it felt to have her close, how her quiet breathing was somehow soothing rather than disturbing, how the cool touch of her skin against his arm was pleasant rather than uncomfortable. Morning was awkward. Lyra woke first. She usually did, and clearly realized their positions before Jake's brain had fully activated. She moved away quickly, her skin cycling through colors that might have been embarrassment, putting distance between them as Jake struggled toward consciousness. "I apologize," she said quietly when Jake finally opened his eyes. "Savathi sometimes unconsciously seek warmth sources during sleep cycles. I did not mean to impose on your personal space." "It's fine," Jake managed, his voice rough with sleep. "You were cold. Body heat is practical warmth source." "Practical," Lyra repeated, and something in her tone suggested she didn't entirely accept that characterization, but she didn't argue. The second night followed an almost identical pattern. They started with careful distance. By morning they were pressed together, and Jake was awake enough this time to notice details. The way Lyra made small content sounds in her sleep when she was warm and comfortable. The way her skin was softest against his where they touched, like silk with subtle texture underneath. The way sharing space with her was becoming less awkward and more comfortable with surprising speed. The third night, they didn't bother with the pretense of starting apart. They got into bed with less distance between them from the beginning, and when Lyra naturally migrated closer seeking warmth, Jake didn't tense up or try to maintain inappropriate distance. He just let her settle against him, let himself feel her skin's coolness contrasted with the warmth where they pressed together. and admitted to himself that whatever boundaries he'd thought were important were being thoroughly crossed, and he couldn't bring himself to care. "Jake," Lyra's voice was quiet in the darkness of his quarters, the only light coming from the dim emergency illumination and the stars visible through his window. "Yeah. When you made your initial joke about me crashing in your bed, was there any part of you that actually wanted it to not be entirely joke?" That was a dangerous question, and Jake knew it. He could deflect, could claim exhaustion was making her ask strange questions, could retreat behind the safe walls of, "We're just colleagues sharing space temporarily for practical reasons." Instead he asked, "Why are you asking?" "Because I accepted your offer, even recognizing it might have been joke, partly hoping it was not entirely joke." Her cool hand found his in the darkness between them. "I would not be here, in this bed, pressed against you, if I did not feel genuine connection with you. And I find myself wondering if perhaps you feel something similar but are constrained by human cultural rules about appropriate workplace relationships." Jake was quiet for a long moment, feeling her hand in his, aware of every point where their bodies touched, his heart doing complicated things in his chest. "Lyra, we work together. There are official protocols about workplace relationships. We have already violated those protocols," she interrupted gently. "I am living in your quarters. We are sharing sleeping space. We wake every morning tangled together. At what point do we acknowledge that protocols are less important than what we actually feel?" "What do you feel?" Jake asked, because apparently his brain had decided honesty was less terrifying than continued pretense. Her skin flickered through those significant colors even in the darkness. "I feel safe with you, comfortable in ways I have not felt with many beings. I enjoy your company beyond mere professional courtesy. I find myself wanting to be near you in ways that have nothing to do with practical temperature management. When you offered your bed, even as joke, part of me hoped deeply that it was genuine offering because I wanted to share space with you in exactly this way." Jake struggled to find words. "That's a lot to process." "Humans excel at indirect communication," Lyra observed. "Scifi prefer directness. I am being direct with you now. I have developed feelings for you that extend beyond collegial friendship. I am asking if you feel anything similar, or if I have badly misread this situation." Jake thought about the past 3 days, about how his quarters felt more alive with her presence in them, about how he'd started looking forward to her morning colors when he woke up, about how sharing the bed had evolved from awkward to comfortable to something he actively wanted, about how he woke earlier than necessary just to have those few minutes of holding her while she still slept, about how his stupid joke about sharing his bed had stopped being entirely joke somewhere around the second time she'd curled against him in sleep, and he'd felt profoundly right about the whole situation. "Yeah," he admitted quietly into the darkness. "I feel something similar, but I genuinely don't know how to navigate that. Different species, workplace protocols, cultural differences I don't fully understand. We navigate it the way we have been navigating everything else," Lyra said simply, her hand squeezing his gently. "With honesty, with communication, with willingness to acknowledge what we feel instead of pretending we do not feel it. Complications exist, we acknowledge them, but we do not allow them to prevent connection that we both clearly want." "And what exactly do we both want?" "I think," Lyra said thoughtfully, moving infinitesimally closer, "we are discovering that together." Jake didn't have a response to that, which was probably fine because Lyra seemed content with silence. They lay like that for a while longer, hands linked, pressed together, both awake and aware and neither willing to move away or pretend this was purely practical thermal management. Eventually sleep claimed them both, still tangled together, the careful distance they'd started with 3 nights ago completely abandoned in favor of genuine closeness that neither could quite justify as purely practical anymore. 1 week into sharing his bed, because Jake had given up pretending this was temporary or that the couch had ever been a serious option, routines had fully developed. His quarters felt like their space now rather than his space she was borrowing. Lyra's belongings had migrated from her designated corner to integrated throughout the environment. Her datapad sat on his desk next to his maintenance manuals. Her preferred tea occupied space in his small kitchen storage. Her sleep clothes were folded in his storage unit next to his own. They woke tangled together now without awkwardness or apology. Jake would wake first usually, would lie still for those few peaceful minutes feeling Lyra pressed against him, her breathing steady, her skin cycling through soft morning colors. When she woke, there would be a moment of eye contact, quiet acknowledgement of their closeness, before they separated to begin their day. They worked their shifts, still partners, still maintaining appropriate professional boundaries in public spaces. But they ate meals together more often than apart now, sat closer during briefings than strictly necessary, found excuses to work in proximity even when their tasks didn't require it. And every night they returned to quarters that felt increasingly like home, to a bed they shared without pretense, to closeness that had evolved beyond thermal practicality into something neither could adequately name but both recognized as significant. "We need to actually talk about what this is," Jake said one evening after their shift, both of them sitting on the bed that had become their shared territory, the careful distance of that first awkward night completely abandoned. "What do you think it is?" Lyra asked, her skin shifting to attentive violet that meant she was focused and curious. "I think it started as my stupid joke that turned into practical arrangement that somewhere along the way became something else entirely. I think I have feelings for you that extend well beyond friendship or collegial professional respect. I think sharing space with you has become important to me in ways that have absolutely nothing to do with you being cold or me having functional environmental controls." Lyra's skin flushed that gold-pink lavender combination, brighter than he'd seen before. For Savathi, what we have been doing, sharing sleeping space night after night, touching freely without hesitation, existing comfortably in each other's constant presence, this is courtship behavior. We are, by my cultural standards and understanding, already in the beginning stages of romantic pair-bonding relationship. And by human standards, we're in extremely complicated territory. Jake ran his hand through his hair. We work together in official capacity. We're different species with different cultural backgrounds. Some humans would argue this violates every professional boundary that exists. "Do you wish to stop?" Lyra asked quietly, her large luminous eyes fixed on him with that intensity he'd grown to love rather than find uncomfortable. Jake realized his answer was immediate and certain, required no thought or consideration. "No. I don't want to stop any of this. I want to figure out how to do this correctly. Then we determine together what correct means for us specifically," Lyra said, moving closer with that fluid grace. "Not what official protocols mandate. Not what either of our cultures typically dictates. What works for Jake Morrison and Lyra as specific individuals building specific relationships. That's an extremely reasonable approach that my anxiety about rule breaking is struggling intensely with." Lyra's skin shifted to amused blue-green. "Your species maintains so many elaborate rules about emotion and connection. Mine has fewer categorical rules but places deeper meaning on connections when they genuinely form. Perhaps we find sustainable balance between your need for structure and my preference for directness. How do we do that?" "We continue being honest as we have been. We acknowledge what we feel rather than pretending we feel nothing. We make decisions together about pace and boundaries that work for both of us." She paused, her skin cycling through slightly uncertain colors. "May I ask you something potentially uncomfortable? You've been asking me potentially uncomfortable questions since you moved in. Why stop now?" "If there were no complications, if we did not work together, if we were the same species, if there were no protocols or cultural differences to navigate, would you want romantic relationship with me?" Jake didn't have to think about his answer. The certainty was absolute and immediate. Yes, absolutely yes. You're brilliant and kind and funny in ways that constantly surprise me. I love your directness, how you observe the world, how your skin tells me what you're feeling before you speak. I love waking up with you. I love the small sounds you make when you're comfortable. I love learning to read your colors. I love talking with you about everything and nothing. If there were no complications whatsoever, I would be actively pursuing romantic relationship with you. Then pursue romantic relationship with me despite complications, Lyra said with that simple Savathi logic. Complications exist. We acknowledge them. We will need to navigate them carefully. But we do not allow them to prevent connection we both clearly want and have already begun building. You make it sound simple. But perhaps it is simple, and humans have overcomplicated it unnecessarily. Jake laughed despite himself, realizing she was probably completely correct. He'd been so focused on rules and protocols and potential problems that he'd been ignoring the fundamental truth. He wanted this, wanted her, wanted whatever they were building together in his quarters night after night. Okay, he said decisively. We're doing this, officially. Romantic relationship, cross-species complications and workplace protocols and all. Lyra's skin flashed brilliant gold, brighter than he'd ever seen, like sunlight on water. Then, by Savathi cultural standards, I should inform you that shared sleeping space is considered first step in bonding process. Physical affection beyond mere proximity is typically next step in courtship, if both parties are comfortable with such progression. Define physical affection in this specific context. Instead of answering verbally, Lyra moved closer still and very carefully, very deliberately, rested her cool hand against the side of Jake's face. Her opalescent skin was smooth with that subtle texture underneath, and her large luminous eyes were fixed on his with complete attention and affection so obvious it made Jake's heart do complicated acrobatics. He leaned into her touch, covering her hand with his own. Like this, she confirmed softly, touching freely without practical justification, expressing affection physically. For Savathi, skin-to-skin contact is profoundly significant. Our skin is much more developed sensory organ than human equivalent. Touch carries deep meaning for us, communicates emotion in ways your species uses verbal language. Touch is significant for humans too, Jake said, bringing his other hand up to very gently touch her face in return. Different mechanisms maybe, but we also express things through physical contact that we struggle to articulate verbally. Then perhaps our species are more compatible in this regard than different. What followed was careful, exploratory, and tender in ways Jake hadn't experienced before. They learned how each species expressed physical affection, Savathi through deliberate skin contact that created cascading color changes, communicating emotion in real time. Humans through varied touch that expressed feeling through pressure and warmth and sustained presence. Jake discovered that running his fingers along Lyra's arm created rippling color shifts like waves across water. That touching her face made her skin flush brilliant gold and pink. That she made soft sounds of contentment when he held her close. That she instinctively sought contact, gravitating toward warmth and closeness in ways that seemed built into her biology. Lyra learned that humans responded to sustained contact, that Jake's breathing changed when she touched him, that he unconsciously pulled her closer when they were together, that his heartbeat, which she could feel through his skin, accelerated when she was near in ways that indicated affection rather than stress. They didn't rush toward anything beyond gentle exploration, both aware they were navigating genuinely new territory, that cross-species physical intimacy required careful attention and communication. But they established clearly that this was real, that they both wanted it, that they were willing to figure out the complexities together. That night, they slept even more closely tangled than before, without any remaining pretense or hesitation. Jake held Lyra close, feeling her cool skin against his warmth, her steady breathing, the occasional color shifts even in sleep. She curled against him with complete trust, her hand resting over his heart, her head tucked perfectly under his chin. "Jake," she murmured, already half asleep. "Yeah. Thank you for making joke about sharing your bed, even if you did not entirely mean it at the time." He laughed quietly. "Thank you for taking it seriously, even when I claimed it was completely joke." "I knew it was not entirely joke," Lyra said, her voice drowsy. "Humor frequently contains truth that humans are afraid to speak directly." "But you're probably completely right about that." She was already asleep again, peaceful and content and safe. Jake lay awake slightly longer, processing how a careless throwaway comment about sharing his bed had evolved into genuine romantic relationship with someone who had taken his words more seriously than he'd consciously intended, but exactly as seriously as some part of him had genuinely hoped. Sometimes the best connections formed from jokes that weren't entirely jokes, from cultural misunderstandings that forced uncomfortable honesty, from accidental invitations that became deliberate choices. Jake had joked about Lyra sharing his bed. She had taken him seriously. And somewhere in that gap between human humor and sci-fi directness, between his deflection and her acceptance, they had built something real and meaningful and worth whatever complications came with it. The communal quarters' environmental controls got fixed 2 weeks later. Station maintenance finally allocated resources, completed repairs, certified the spaces as fully habitable again. Lyra didn't move back. Her belongings stayed integrated with Jake's. Her space in his bed remained permanent. Her presence in his life transitioned from temporary arrangement to deliberate choice that neither questioned. When colleagues eventually noticed and HR sent carefully worded inquiries about current living arrangements, Jake and Lyra filed the appropriate relationship disclosure paperwork together. They navigated the mild bureaucratic complexity with patience. They confirmed yes, they were in romantic relationship. Yes, they understood relevant protocols, and no, they had no interest in changing their current situation. Jake never joked casually about sharing his bed anymore. The words carried too much weight now, too much genuine meaning. Lyra never felt the need to joke about something that had worked out exactly as she'd hoped from the moment she'd chosen to take his words seriously. And they both learned that sometimes cultural misunderstandings created exactly the right kind of understanding, the kind where two beings from different worlds found common ground in shared space, honest communication, and the willingness to take each other seriously, even when humor tried to